All right. It's been a long ass day. My energy not right. I don't got my energy right, but I wanna go through and keep reading. I don't wanna. I don't know. Long ass day. All right, we're reading In Defense of Looting. In Defense of Looting by Vicky Osterweil. We're on chapter 8, Civil Riots. While snake deep in the struggle in the South, Martin Luther King's SCLC moved north. There they found, although economic and housing discrimination created much the same condition as in the South, nonviolent marches were much less effective. When Martin Luther King marched to Chicago, unlike his small southern towns, thousands of white supremacists could come out to a counter-protest, an incredibly threatening and disempowering experience. Mayor Richard Daley also demonstrated the anti-movement efficacy of Northern Democratic politicians as he appeared publicly to negotiate and accept movement demands while actually stonewalling on all but the most minor concessions. There's a documentary entitled King in the Wilderness, which I would encourage everybody to go and watch. Very informative about some of the struggles that Dr. King and the SCLC engaged in. But in that documentary, Dr. King speaks about how the most racist place that he encountered, the most racist state he encountered, the state with the most racism being espoused, was Illinois. Andrew Young, who was with him in the struggle in Chicago and with him in struggles in multiple other places, also spoke about their experience in Illinois and spoke about it in a very negative manner. And I think that's important for us to point out because I think far too often we get caught up in speaking about how racist the South is or how racist these southern states are. And I think that Malcolm X said it best. If you in Canada, if you below the Canadian border, then everywhere is the South. And so I think we have to keep that in mind. As a result of these experiences, Martin Luther King grew increasingly radical and pessimistic about reform. He began believing that black people were, quote, integrating into a burning house, end quote, and that a more fundamental socialist transformation of society was required. By 1967, he was arguing for radical fundamental change because, quote, only by structural change can current evils be eliminated because the roots are in the system rather than in man or faulty operations, end quote. And that goes back to speaking about institutional racism and institutional prejudices as opposed to speaking about individualistic racism and individualistic prejudices. And the reason that we have to shift the conversation from individual to institutional is because we have seen that trying to address individual racism will not even if we got rid of all individual racism tomorrow, as long as institutions continue to be rooted on the racism which they are rooted in now, we will still see the racial injustice continue to rear its ugly head because the institutional root causes have not been addressed. So again, here we're speaking on institutional racism. Okay. As he would put it in a speech in 1967, quote, it didn't cost a penny to deal with the lunch counters and quote, it didn't cost a penny to deal with lunch counters and integrate lunch counters. It didn't cost the nation 1 penny to guarantee the right to vote. It is much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to eradicate slums, end quote. The country wasn't willing to do the latter, and as more and more activists recognized the fact, they started proclaiming their allegiance to revolution. Those in power were forced into giving concessions, and they did so with money. Federal funding to cities, towns, and social initiatives increased dramatically. Liberals hope to mitigate the effects of rioters' victory by buying off the rioters' allegiance, producing government programs that will co-opt and contain activist energy, bringing their grassroots organizing effort into working for government programs, as their predecessors had done with the New Deal. This had partially worked in 1963 and 1964 when core and SNCC activists in the South focused their efforts on voter registration, despite the fact that the locals consistently wanted them to tackle economic issues. They were receiving much of their funding from Democratic Party organs, anxious to keep their hold on the South, and so kept the focus on the elections. That's something that we've also seen happen here. Last year, when we were waging a struggle that we're still waging for lives, for black lives, you've seen how these black liberals and these white liberals try to co-opt it to make it a struggle for electoral politics, to make it a struggle for voting. I can't tell you the amount of times where I would be speaking to someone of an older generation, and I would be telling them, and one of the things that they would say is that, you need to get more people to vote, or you need to get more people to go out and vote, or you need to have people registering voters at the protest. And there were some different events that we held that did have people there that were signing people up to vote. But I think that we cannot make the mistake of confusing electoral politics with issues of humanity. We cannot make the mistake of confusing these issues of humanity even with economic issues and financial issues. The same way that money will not liberate black people, neither will any politician liberate black people. We can't look at these politicians as if they are some type of superheroes that will get voted in, get into these offices and change everything for black people. Electoral politics has to be one avenue that we use, the same way that economics and finances have to be one avenue that we use. We cannot allow any of these to be the absolute avenues or the only ways or even the main ways that we are waging this struggle. So we have to build community power, the same way that liberals and politicians are trying to build electoral power. We have to build community power. And that's more complicated than just signing somebody up to vote, which is why they push to me, one of the reasons they push electoral politics is because electoral politics is a much more simpler thing. It's much more simply defined. It has beginnings and endings that are a lot easier. And most people who engage in electoral politics, in all honesty, are people who that's the most that they do. They go and they vote for somebody, and then they don't follow up with this person that they vote for. They'll vote for the person to be the state's attorney, or vote for somebody to be an alder person, but they don't follow up once these people are put into seats and positions of power. They don't go to the city council meetings. They're not setting up meetings with these people who have been elected to see what progress that is being made. So we have to get past just depending on electoral politics to save us. And we have to understand why other people are trying to push electoral politics as a means of saving us. Okay, let's pick up on page 205. President Lyndon Baines Johnson's attempts to tackle the racial and economic crises of the period, his war on poverty and Great Society programs, were despised by white reactionaries, while in radicalized poor and black communities they were recognized as insufficient and ineffective band-aids. In most cities, war on poverty programs just increased funding to existing infrastructures, thus doubling down on education, youth, and job training programs that were already failing black ghetto residents. Mired in bureaucratic problems, based in an analysis that saw both unrest and racial discriminations as crime, which is to say, as problems caused by individuals, Johnson's programs couldn't offer the fundamental transformation and empowerment the movement pointed toward. And anyway, the cost of the war on poverty paled in comparison to the cost of the war on impoverished people of Vietnam. As many activists pointed out at the time, imperialist war in Vietnam kept the ghetto poor. I think that's something also that we should point out because we are today. I believe they just spoke about the last troops leaving Afghanistan, and then as far back as I can remember, I'm 29 years old. This war is in Afghanistan have been going on for the last 20 years. We have been involved in a war in this country, and I think Dr. King put it best when he was speaking about the war in Vietnam, and he spoke about how war numbs the senses of people. When you see all these people dying overseas, and then it numbs and normalizes the death. So that way, when someone is killed by a police officer or someone has some type of injustice done to them here in this country, people are numb to it because of the amount of death and violence that is perpetuated from wars that we are waging. And again, that's sort of off on a separate subject. But what I wanted to point out is just as when the Vietnam War was being engaged, there were funds that were going to wage that war in Vietnam that would have been better off being put in our own country and building up infrastructures and changing the infrastructure and institutions in our own country and building up neighborhoods and communities in our own country. That would have been better for us and gotten us to a more progressive place as opposed to that money being used to perpetuate imperialism and perpetuate war in other countries. And that's something and that same concept has to be used, or theory has to be used currently. The 20 years that we've spent over in Afghanistan, the amount of resources, the amount of manpower, the amount of people that have lost their lives all over there, those are things that could have been resources and people that could have all been here helping to build up the communities that need to be built up here, helping to change these institutions and these infrastructures that need to be changed here. And we have to get to a place of where we recognize all of these different things that are happening, and we can articulate how all of these different actions lead towards perpetuating racial injustices in our country. Hold on, we got a battery starting to trip. I'm gonna switch these batteries out real quick. 1 second. All right. Okay, let's keep on reading. These crickets loud as hell. The lead up to the Newark uprising was marked by conflict around all these problems. Increasing grassroots activity and increasing awareness of the limits of political participation marked the years before the riots in Newark. From 1965, black women, as they always do, had taken the lead in organizing, pushing for maximum benefit from the new War on Poverty programs. They tried to take control of the local area boards that distributed funds. They educated their neighbors and communities on how to apply for grants and foundations, and they built programs for housing stock improvement, social centers, and other such projects. But all of this required constant, exhausting struggle with the government bureaucracy, struggle that often failed to achieve activists' goals. There was also organized massive rallies and memorials for black residents murdered by police. Only a few weeks before the uprisings, police on the East Orange, Newark border had raided, fought with, and arrested Nation of Islam militants, increasing tensions. And Amiri Baraka and his Spirit House group were transforming and politicizing the culture of Newark with black nationalist poetry readings and street theater performances that not only featured political themes but also became themselves rallies and protests. It is in this context that Newark police ruthlessly beat and arrested cab driver John Smith on the night of July 12, 1967, setting off 6 days of massive rioting. The police and National Guard killed 24 people. Quote, more than 1,100 sustained injuries, approximately 1,400 were arrested, some 350 arsons damaged private and public buildings, millions of dollars of merchandise was destroyed or stolen, and law enforcement expended 13,326 rounds of ammunition, end quote. As in Watts, the people held the initiative on the first few days, after which point massive violence, collective punishment, and repression on the part of the police and the National Guard began to win the struggle. Looting was massive and organized. The rioters used Molotov cocktails and attacks on police and property. A few months before the riots, an anonymous pamphlet had circulated with instructions on how to make them. Despite this militancy, though, the rioting in Newark was experienced as a massive party. Indeed, quote, on a profound level, the gleeful spirits of the riots crowd disturbed police officials as much as the prospect of violence. When Newark's police director, Dominic Spina, toured the riot scene with Mayor Adenizio and Governor Hughes, Hughes was said to have been particularly appalled at the holiday air he felt in the ghetto, end quote. The experience of pleasure, joy, and freedom in the midst of a riot, an experience we almost never have in these city streets where we are exploited, controlled, and dominated, is a force that transforms rioters, sometimes forever. The experience of such freedom can be unforgettable. And it was movement people fighting in the streets. The riots kicked off after demonstrations were organized and core activist Robert Curvin appealed to crowds outside the precinct house where Smith was being held. In one of the most infamous moments of the riot, Amiri Baraka was pulled from a car by police and beaten within an inch of his life. The people fighting in the streets of Newark were not sudden opportunists. They have been educated and politicized by years of steady movement and struggle. As in Watts and other cities, signs and windows protected black-owned businesses from attack, although in Newark, this had a sinister twist. In the final days of rioting, police and National Guard drove through town, shooting out the windows and shooting up the businesses that rioters had carefully protected. Police again killed on sight for looting, for example, shooting Billy Furr, 24, in the back, murdering him directly in front of a reporter and photographer for Life magazine. Furr had been looting a six-pack of beer. The photos of his murder were seen by millions. And again, that gets us back into these institutions prioritizing property over people, which is, again, a form of maintaining the status quo. As we get closer and closer, as we continue to read this book and we get closer and closer to the years that we are in, the time that we are in, you see that multiple of these riots, multiples of these moments, the catalyst for them are police terrorism actions and attacks. And again, I don't know what type of sick ideology or sick I don't know what type of sick ideology you must have as an individual to feel that somebody stealing a six-pack of beer justifies them being murdered, or somebody stealing anything justifies them being murdered. There is no city and there's no city, no state, no county which the penalty for stealing is death or the electric chair. But somehow when these actions begin to happen in this, and people don't, mostly it's because people do not like the reasons that people are engaging in these actions. People don't like don't agree with, or people have issues with the community that are engaging in these actions. And it's less about the actions, because people steal every day, and nobody would say that everybody who don't scan something at Walmart should be shot down. But somebody would say if a Walmart was being looted, that the person deserves to be shot down. And again, that's because, as Vicky is pointing out, looting has been something that has a political connotation to it. And there are people who do not like the political connotation to the action of looting when protests take place and when demonstrations take place or when uprisings take place. And again, we have to make sure that we understand just how far back these things go. The 60s was not the first time people looted. Black people in an effort for liberation were not the first people to do looting in this country. The first people to do looting in this country were the Europeans that came over here, were the white people that were here. And so the black community and black people as a nation in this country, Africans as a people, descendants of slaves in this country have learned off the political actions that their white counterparts have done. And anybody who pays attention to history understands how often looting and rioting and uprisings have been part of the political DNA of this country, political makeup of this country. And nobody got no problem with the Boston Tea Party. But Billy Furr got murdered for a 6-pack of beer. Okay, let's keep on reading. And then again, you see these police officers. The police officers went, and the National Guard went and shot up the businesses that people hadn't looted. All right, let's keep going. But many were also killed as police. Quote, fighting against snipers, end quote, fired indiscriminately into apartment buildings and homes. Though some people in Newark fired guns at the police, these shots were much less widespread than reported. Where shooting did occur, it tended to be warning or pot shots, fired to keep police and firemen away from the areas of looting and arson. Still, media, police, and National Guardsmen hysterically circulated the idea of sniping to justify collective punishment. Across the riots of the period, dozens of people were murdered in their homes by police and guardsmen firing into apartment buildings, quote, in fear of snipers, end quote. The chain of command told guardsmen that they were heading into an area of massive sniping to terrify them and authorize them to murder black civilians. The media, embedded as it was in police stations and guard posts, reported on this, quote, widespread, end quote, sniping, thus deepening repressive forces' fear on the ground while explaining the repression to the rest of the country. White supremacist forces always play the victim to justify their ongoing anti-black oppression. I would encourage, and this is, I'm gonna say this not because I think it's this that great of a film. I think that the film could have been done much better. But it does get across to you some of the inhumaneness that these police officers engage in during these uprisings. It's a film entitled Detroit, which speaks about the uprisings that took place in Detroit. It is a very difficult film to watch. It's a very hard film to watch. It is sort of, in some manners, it feels as if it is just black trauma being perpetuated. But I think that it is important for people to, I think it's a film that is important to watch. Anybody who reads this book, anybody who is reading and learning about some of these uprisings that took place in the 60s and the violent nature that police officers and National Guardsmen engaged in during these things, I would encourage people to go watch the film Detroit. It paints this picture very well, even though it is difficult at times to digest. But despite the repression, the uprising marked an important turn for the Newark movement. Its many trends, black nationalism, black arts, anti-police activism, welfare activism, and black community control, consolidated and grew into a unified movement for black power after the riots. The movement center formed around the Community for Unified Newark, an umbrella organization that had begun life as the United Brothers. The United Brothers literally formed as concerned activists gathered at Amiri Baraka's bedside while he recovered from the police beating he endured in the riots. As Kamasi Woodard writes, quote, the Black Power movement rose like phoenix out of the ashes of the Newark Rebellion. CFUN came to symbolize the politics born of the urban uprisings, end quote. Rather than forming a national militant revolutionary party like the Panthers, CFUN took a different approach to addressing the political and economic crises of the ghetto. As Woodard records, CFUN ran candidates for public office, fashioned public policies, advocated reforms, mobilized huge demonstrations to resist President Richard Nixon's political reaction, and, above all, established an elaborate network of institutions, programs, and business. The Spirit House Movers and Players for drama and poetry, the African Free School for early childhood education, the Black Newark newspaper for local communication, the Unity and Struggle newspaper for national politics, Events Incorporated for public relations, proposals for development grants, and Kawaida Towers and the NJR 32 Project Area Committee for urban planning and community development. The full story of CFUN and the inspiring struggle for political transformation in Newark is beyond the remit of this book. But the movement in Newark points to the fact that hardly an instigator of open, excuse me, but the movement in Newark points to the fact that hardly an instigator of only openly insurrectionary politics, riots, and uprisings can inspire and expand movements that are based around predominantly nonviolent community campaigns for political, cultural, and social power. There is nothing, quote, riot-like, end quote, about the activities or tactics of CFUN. Nevertheless, it was born as Newark burned. An insurrection in Detroit will move out of the streets and into the factories, giving birth to one of the last major radical U.S. labor movements of the 20th century. Okay, and so now they're about to begin to speak on the uprisings that took place in Detroit, which is what I was just alluding to in the movie when I talked about the film Detroit. So what we have had here, I want to just go through and review this chapter. This chapter is called Civil Riots, and one of the things that has been a regularity, or one of the themes of this has been three different cities that dealt with civil riots in the 60s. The first one that we read about was the riots that took place in Watts, and we read about how the Black Panther Party was born from those ashes. We read about the things that were going on in the community leading up to the Watts riot. We spoke about what the catalyst of it was, which was someone being arrested. A young man was a police terrorism attack. A young man was arrested. He was outside of his car. He was arrested. Then his mother came and his brother came. The police beat up him, his mother, and his brother. And then the Watts riot began. We just read about how in Newark, again, another act of police terrorism is what precipitated the uprising and the riot. And for anybody who has been paying attention to what's happened here in this community and what happened in other communities last year, you know that these uprisings that have been taking place over these last couple of years, or over this year and last year, were also initiated by actions of police terrorism. Same thing when Ferguson burned, action of police terrorism. L.A. in 91, act of police terrorism. And so we see how we see that these are commonalities and being catalysts to spark these uprisings. And you also see how they're speaking about how these cities and these communities have not only been dealing with police terrorism and racial injustice for decades and in years leading up to this, but you also see how they have been trying to form ways of struggling against these actions. And when these uprisings occur, you see that the people who were struggling beforehand, or people who are maybe becoming more conscious about these things beforehand, after this uprising happens, they use it as a catalyst to accumulate power, to accumulate movement building. And so that's when we talk about commonalities between what we're reading and what in books and what we're experiencing in real life. That is one of the commonalities that we have to address. Again, the May 30th Alliance is named, its namesake is after actions of police terrorism occurred outside of District 1. We were our most infamous set of campaigns is the City Market campaign that we put on last year. And again, police terrorism was at the center of that. As we are doing the occupation at City Hall, police terrorism has been at the center of the things we're bringing awareness of. And so again, we have to learn from history and learn things that have happened in the past. And in the past, cities and communities have found ways to build power after uprisings, after these actions of police terrorism. And so we have to do that same job as a community and not allow May 30th to be something that is just forgotten about. May 30th must become something that is written in books, the same way that Watts and Newark and Detroit coming up here are written about. Okay, we're on page 209 of Civil Riots. Late in the night of July 23rd, 1967, 6 days after the smoke had cleared over the Newark skyline, Detroit police raided an unlicensed after-hours drinking club. Rather than a few drunks, police were surprised to find more than 80 partiers celebrating two veterans' safe return from Vietnam. Rather than disperse the crowd, police decided to arrest and brutalize them all. 5 days later, 43 people were dead, 1,189 were injured, and 7,200 were in jail. 1,300 buildings were utterly destroyed, and 2,700 businesses have been looted. Other than the Los Angeles riots of 1992 and the New York City draft riots of 1863, this was the largest riot in American history. 5 days later, the American auto industry, centered in Detroit, was the engine and center of American capitalism for the first half of the 20th century. And, as is inevitable in major centers of capitalist dynamism and power, Detroit features some of the most dramatic social conflict in the country. The Detroit strike of 1933 and the Flint sit-down strikes in 1936 to 1937 against General Motors were among the hardest fought in the Great Depression. The Detroit race riots of 1943 have been the largest and most violent of the 20th century. But white flight, automation, and deindustrialization meant Detroit was in trouble by 1967. Detroit and the car industry were no longer the driving economic power in American society, although it was hard to recognize this from the inside at first. The full fallout and effects of these trends would only be recognized in the decades following the riots. As a result, white folks have often blamed Detroit's decline on the riots, despite the simultaneous industrial decline of the entire Midwest. It's not surprising the riots traumatized and terrified the white powers of Detroit. Unlike in Newark and Watts, where fear of snipers was mostly unjustified, Detroit saw some actual sniping. The first night they were deployed, the National Guard indiscriminately fired machine guns from the streets into apartment buildings, claiming they were fighting snipers, killing 9, none of whom were proven to have weapons. And that's one of the commonalities also with these institutions, and as you go back through the years, is that they'll kill somebody claiming that they had a gun, or they thought they had a gun, or they thought they seen a gun. And regularly you come to find out that there is no gun, there is no weapon. And who knows how many times that they've just planted the gun there to make up for the fact that they were wrong, or that there was not a weapon there on the scene. Again, here, just in 2021, Tyrus Jones, a young man who was unarmed, was shot while running away by the Rockford Police Department. The officer said the reason he shot him is because he thought he saw a gun. There was no gun recovered from the scene. And so that's 2021 in Rockford that happened. And then when you go and read in Detroit in 1967, you can read about how 9 people were shot and killed by these police officers under the guise that they had a gun or they had a weapon. And then when you come to find out, they didn't have a gun. They did have a weapon. And nothing happens to these police officers who make these mistakes and rob people of their lives. They just go right back out on the streets. Okay. Looters were shot on sight, a direct order from the National Guard command hierarchy, and police and guardsmen were caught moving and rearranging bodies to indicate the people they killed had been looting. In the face of this violence, snipers started shooting back. Things got so serious in Detroit that LBJ sent in the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions of the U.S. Army, which has seen combat in Vietnam. Rolling through Detroit in tanks and armored personnel carriers, soldiers came straight from murdering Vietnamese people to attack and murder black Americans. And that's something that even happens now. The Army was not sent in this past year and a half. But the National Guard was. But a lot of police officers are people who served overseas. And so a lot of people, like right now, there are people who are coming from murdering people in Afghanistan, killing people in Afghanistan, murdering people in Iraq, killing people overseas, and will come here to Rockford or to Illinois and kill black people here. Because the same way when they go and occupy territory or occupy space in these other nations, in these other countries, and those people of color become the enemies. When they come here, they occupy space in communities that are predominantly black or predominantly brown, and those people become the enemies. And so again, this cycle continues not only externally in this country, but internally in this country as well. And the black and so again, a lot of these things that we're reading in here, again, it's difficult to read through these things, but I would encourage people to go watch the film Detroit. Go and visually see these things happen. There was one, I don't know if they'll speak about this in here or not, but one young girl was a tank blew out. It was somebody was riding in a tank. They heard a gunshot. Supposedly, they turned the head of the tank towards the window of this apartment building and shoot a big missile into the window, blows up the whole room. They show you how it was a little girl that was in there right beforehand and she dies. The scene was so gruesome and so just disturbing to me. I had to stop the film to Google if this was true. I was like, did the person who made this movie just insert this sick ass scene in here of this little girl being killed to upset me or to cause some type of emotional response? And I Googled it and I looked it up and it was true. That is what happened. Somebody was riding in a tank in the midst of these uprisings happening, thought that they heard a gunshot, thought somebody was shooting, somebody yelled sniper or some shit like that from the ground. This person was in a tank. The tank turned its head towards an apartment window where a little girl was in, and they blew the whole apartment. They shot a missile in there and blew it up, killed the little black girl. And again, that's something it's hard to digest watching that in this film, especially because I don't believe that the film did a good enough job of inserting humanity and care into these situations. But it does also do a good job of just showing the raw violence that these institutions use in these communities of color. Multiple children were killed in Detroit. Rest in power. Many radicals fetishize military-style conflict as the sign of true revolutionary potential. This was especially true of the movements of the late 60s and early 70s that all proclaimed armed struggle and saw the, quote, guerrilla, end quote, as something of a revolutionary saint. But the revolutionary content of the riots does not lie mainly in these military aspects. The shooting is a small piece, not the main component of the attack on white supremacy, the state, property, and the commodity. Whereas armed self-defense will always be an important part of the struggles for liberation, the arms themselves have no magical property to make our movements more serious, more revolutionary, more powerful. The power of the attack on white settler society is seen instead in the broad lawlessness, property destruction, looting, and cop-free zones produced by the riot, and is reflected in the attendant sense of freedom, unity, and radical safety felt by the rioters. There's an asterisk down here. Let's read through the asterisk portion. The shooting of a few cops and soldiers may well be necessary in the course of a revolutionary struggle, but the emphasis on snipers by the police and media isn't merely a repressive justification strategy. It is also a kind of strategic optimism. The state wants to face its enemies in a military conflict, not a social one. The state wants to fight an army, not a mob. Armies, even, perhaps especially, guerrilla ones, are shaped around technical expertise and organizations, supply lines and chains and logistics, hierarchy, the harshest discipline, right to punishment up to and including death, laws of conduct, and an overarching force of social unification. These are all core factors of a state. Any army must become a functional state in miniature. Thus, even if the revolutionaries win the war, the state will preserve, merely transfer to more progressive bureaucrats. Real revolution will have been prevented in the militarization of the conflict, which really means the bureaucratization of the revolutionaries. This, no doubt, must be one of the basic lessons of the 20th century revolutions and anti-colonial victories that in many places dramatically improved daily life, but everywhere failed to revolutionize it. All right, let's keep reading. Detroit was in full-blown insurrection. Arsonists in Detroit controlled their fires much less effectively than rebels had in Newark and Watts, as a strong wind was blowing off Lake Erie throughout the days of the riot. As a result, fire spread much farther in Detroit, destroying many homes, not just businesses. But despite this, participation in rioting was truly widespread. In Detroit, as Malcolm McLaughlin records, quote, the Kerner Commission's researchers were surprised that half of the 7,000 people arrested had never been in trouble with the law before. It seemed that people who weren't involved in things before were getting involved in this. Even people who are living relatively stable lives have become involved in some connection with the disturbances, end quote. Widespread popular participation by previously uninvolved or unradicalized people in mass illegal activity points to the desire for, Widespread popular participation by previously uninvolved or unradicalized people in mass illegal activity points to the desire for and possibilities of a more total social transformation that rests within everyone, not just the already activated, and is one of the vital facts marked by urban uprisings. And again, that's something that I can also speak of because I had not been in before May 30th happened and before some of the uprisings that happened in this country after the murder of George Floyd. I had not been involved with protests or demonstrations or organizing or mobilizing. And this was a catalyst for me as well. And I know that that's true for very many people involved in these things over this past year, becoming involved in these things, is that up until this point, we had not been involved. And I believe that that's something that is a normal occurrence that will continue to happen when certain moments in time happen. Is if you can continue your movement going past a specific moment in time, what lies ahead is another one of those moments in time. And if your movement and if the things that you have been building and putting together can continue to exist in the meantime before another one of those moments come, you will be able to pull the most out of that moment when it arrives again. The next time a moment like May 30th arrives again in this city, the May 30th Alliance will be able to pull exponentially more power from that moment than we were able to pull from May 30th when there was no organization, when we were not activated in some sort of a sense in the community. And so, again, that's one of the reasons why we have to maintain movements and maintain organizing past the moment in which everybody is engaged in it, past the moment in which everybody wants to be a part of it, or not everybody, but a larger portion wants to be a part of it. And we have to understand that there will be ebbs and flows, and not become discouraged when you don't see the same type of turnout or the same type of a reaction from the community that came from an event that was 5 months earlier or 10 months earlier. We must just continue to struggle with the understanding that this community has the capacity to turn out in that manner. I believe what keeps the May 30th Alliance struggling in the manner in which we do is because we've seen the capacity that this community has. We've seen the capacity that this county, that this city has when it comes to combating these issues. And it's our responsibility and duty to make sure that it is a platform that exists still once that capacity is reached again. Community leaders and nonviolence advocates appeared on the scene to try to calm the situation and were rebuffed. U.S. Representative John Conyers was shouted down when he tried to address a crowd, while MLK, who had been heckled in Watts, was laughed at in Detroit. Nonviolence was utterly rejected by a crowd made up of perhaps 20% of the population. Nonviolence as a philosophy had been fully defeated in the streets. Echoes of this rejection of elite leaders reverberated during the Ferguson uprising of 2014, when professional de-escalators Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson, sent in to discipline and shut down the crowds, were instead booed off stage and out of town. And that's one of the things that I believe we have been, as an organization, very good at doing. I've never tried to tell people which ways to express their emotions, or tell people which tactics are proper or improper. That's speaking on. I'm talking about speaking on tactics of people in the streets, tactics of people in demonstrations, because I do believe that is how you alienate people. That is much different than speaking about people's tactics when it comes to taking pictures with the police. Those things should be criticized. People's tactics when it comes to assisting the city government with co-opting a movement for Black lives and trying to turn it into a movement for Black electoral politics or a movement for Black economic advance. Those type of tactics must be attacked publicly and openly, so that way we can no longer have members of our community engaging in those type of tactics. But if people are, on the streets, I believe that we should have a a conversation about tactics. We should have a conversation about ideology and about thought patterns. But if people are in the streets and doing actions that they believe and that have been done historically to liberate black people, I believe that there should be room made for them to do those things. And there should be a understanding of why those people are doing those things. And we must communicate to those people, not that they are doing the wrong thing or they should be nonviolent or any of those things. We should communicate to them. The importance in having multiple strategies to deal with the issues that we have in the streets. And we should also be trying to find some type of common connection in a way that we can build bridges with people who would choose to be not nonviolent, not alienating those people. And so I personally try to do the job every day of doing that, of not trying to. I don't want to alienate anybody who is not an advocate for nonviolence. The same way I don't want to alienate anyone who is an advocate for nonviolence. But I believe that that both of those things have to be done in an effort to liberate black people. Both of those ideologies must exist in an effort to liberate black people. But here, let's keep reading. As in most of these riots, the community was instead led by a core group of rioters, mostly but not exclusively young men. That, quote, leadership, end quote, however, meant inspiration through direct action rather than a more traditional sense of the word. Lead rioters would break windows, knock down doors, throw the first rock, light the first Molotov, or commit an initial act of looting to, quote, create permission, end quote, for the crowd to act similarly. Action inspires action, and though those lead rioters were often organized among themselves, communicating with radios and phones, heading out to vulnerable spots, and fighting or avoiding police in a systematic fashion, they did not lead in the sense of giving orders, building hierarchies, or drawing boundaries. Detroit was home to one of the foremost theorists of this kind of insurrection. Reverend Albert Cleage, who ran the Black Nationalist Shrine of the Black Madonna, had organized and led what had been to that point the biggest civil rights march in history. In the spring of 1963, he and Dr. King marched at the head of 200,000 people through downtown Detroit, a crowd only surpassed by that of the March on Washington. But after the March on Washington, and in particular the violence of Birmingham, Cleage's thinking took a dramatic militant turn, and he began arguing for a, quote, strategy of chaos, end quote. Rejecting nonviolence, his strategy called for using retaliatory violence and escalation, increasing the intensity and spread of riots until demands were met. Quote, we'll get what we're after or we'll tear it up, end quote, was the strategy's summation. In the years leading up to the riots, he was increasingly involved in organizing with the workers in Detroit factories. So when the army finally succeeded in putting down the uprising, political organizers, including Cleage, got to work. As activist historians Dan Georgicus and Marvin Sirkin write in their seminal Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, an attempt to organize the power of the Great Rebellion into a political force capable of restructuring American society began as soon as minimal order had been restored by the National Guard and police. Black-owned newspapers and organizations of black industrial workers began to present a series of programs and revolutionary visions in sharp contrast to the ideas put forward by the government and labor bureaucracy response to the riots, the New Detroit Committee. That organizing first manifested in the collective Inner City Voice, which published a newspaper of the same name, and which, quote, was to be a positive response to the Great Rebellion, elaborating, clarifying, and articulating what was already in the streets. Inner City Voice pushed forward the cause of the Great Rebellion and is, quote, shopping for free, end quote, referring to the rebellion as, quote, the general strike of 67, end quote. The Voice eventually became Drum, the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, a black workers' organization instigating revolutionary unionism within the auto industry. Within months of becoming Drum, members had instigated a wildcat strike at Dodge's biggest plant, Dodge, Maine, involving 4,000 workers. Drum and other revolutionary movements in the auto industry came together to form the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, which struggled against the bosses and the United Auto Workers, UAW, alike. The UAW was, like most in the United States, a racist union. Black workers were completely underrepresented in union positions, and many unionized shops within the plants were still entirely white. And the top of the UAW bureaucracy were as rich as many in the higher ranks of the auto industry and a key part of the Detroit power structure. The League created a militant labor power to counter the UAW and fight for real worker control of the factories and the community. The League of Revolutionary Black Workers balanced on the cutting edge of a massive wave of radical labor action. The period of 1967 through 1974 saw the most yearly strikes and days lost to strike action in the United States since 1946. For years, League members broke down racial barriers in the auto industry, organized massive strikes, and created a militant labor culture unseen since the 40s, one that merged with the black radical tradition and anti-racist struggles of the 60s to form a revolutionary black labor movement. This movement, too, was born of riots. Okay, and so then that gets us to the end of the section on Detroit. So now we've went through three different uprisings, civil riots that took place in the 60s, Newark, Watts, and Detroit. And each one of them at the end, we have seen how they built organizations using these uprisings as a catalyst, and those organizations began to struggle for some of the things that people were rising up against during these civil riots. And again, because the job that we want to do here is to make sure that we're correlating things that are in this literature to where we are at in this movement, it's important to point out that that is one of the things that we have done here. And again, when we a lot of times people ask, what's the end goal, or what are you trying to accomplish? And I'm highly against trying to answer that question because I don't believe that we are anywhere close enough to the end goal, or anywhere close enough to the finish line to be able to visualize what that looks like, or to envision what that looks like. I don't think that on the second game of any season in any sport, somebody can be able to truly visualize. No, not even that should be wrong. That's not a right way to put it. I don't believe at the beginning of anybody's career in anything they could be able to tell you what the end of their career is going to look like. They may be able to, the same way with the life. Somebody when your child's 10 years old, you don't know what your child's life's going to be like when they're 80. And again, there's people who will try to assume those things, or try to make their own decision for how they want those things to be. You can make plans for your life. We can sit here and make plans or desires for what we will want this movement to look like at the end. But since we don't have the control over all the things that will happen in the midst of this movement, we will never be able to decide those things. But I think that what we can do is we can use as a measuring stick what other cities and what other communities have been able to create after uprisings have taken place, or after a series or campaigns of demonstrations have taken place. And what we have seen in Newark, and what we've seen in Watts, and what we've seen in Detroit is that organizations were built that could accumulate the power that people felt they didn't have when they struck out in these civil riots. Organizations were built that could collectively have the voice that communities felt like they didn't have when these uprisings took place. And so when we look back on history and we see that those things have been done, we see that we are also in the process of doing that here. The May 30th Alliance, I believe, collectively gives voice to some of the frustrations that people felt when they went out and they participated in the uprisings that took place here in this city last year. And so with this, civil rights has about, I don't know, like 10. It's about like 3 pages left in civil rights, 4 pages left. So let's continue on. Less than 9 months after the Detroit riots, Martin Luther King was assassinated, shot down on a motel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4th, 1968. Memphis rose up in rebellion. Within a week, riots had spread to 125 cities, where massive rioting was met with equally massive deployments of the U.S. Army and the National Guard. The insurrection in D.C. got within 2 blocks of the White House, quote, and machine guns were mounted on the Capitol balcony and the White House lawn. 46 people were killed across the country. 2,500 were injured, and it took 70,000 federal troops to restore order. The April uprisings in 1968, taking place during the Holy Week leading up to Easter, created the largest disorder in America since the Civil War, yet remain widely understudied, theorized, or historicized. The silence on the part of historians, scholars, and activists has been deafening. There's an asterisk, so let's read this asterisk right here. As recently as 2018, in a book on the riots of the 1960s, historian Peter Levy could write that beside a single volume written in the immediate aftermath of the riots, these uprisings, quote, have received remarkably little attention. Scholars have virtually ignored them, end quote. I'll also say for my part that the most I heard about any of these uprisings, the most I learned about any of these uprisings all took place last spring and summer as I was studying different moments in American history and studying different figures in American history. Again, I do think that that is purposeful, because when you look and you see some of the things that came out of these uprisings and came out of these riots, no, none of these uprisings or riots completely absolved us of the issues that begat them. But plenty of these uprisings and riots led towards the cities in which they were in progressing in some monicum about these issues. And again, I think that you can also sort of look at cities where there was not a historical uprising like that, or there was not a historical civil riot like that, and you can see how those cities are still haven't progressed nearly as much as they should with some of these issues and with some of these topics. And I do believe that it's one of those things where we spoke about this in a previous chapter, which was using guns non-violently, where in what city was it? I don't want to get the city wrong. Hold on one second. Where was it? North Carolina, in Monroe, North Carolina, in 1959. Robert F. Williams and some of the people in the NAACP had organized demonstrations, and when white people came there and when the police came there being racist and trying to use intimidation tactics and trying to use violence against them, they defended themselves. And some people went to jail for them defending themselves. But what they pointed to is that after that initial act of them of defending themselves against this state-sanctioned violence and against this racist violence, that when they continue to do protests and demonstrations in the future, they didn't have to deal with those institutions coming and being violent. They didn't have to deal with white vigilantes coming and being violent, because they understood that if they came there with violence, the people that were there were willing to defend themselves against those things. And so, again, I think that is one of the reasons why I don't consider self-defense to be violence anyways, but I believe that is one of the reasons why we can't allow certain words like nonviolent protesting or peaceful protesting to be used against people that are protesting, or be used to try to leave the people protesting and demonstrating defenseless. Okay, hold on. Let's find back the page that we on. I'm on page. Okay, on page 214. The shock and trauma of King's murder overshadowed the rebellion that it caused, and the massive, furious, unorganized, and spontaneous nationwide uprisings fits nearly into few theories of protest or revolution. Unlike other riots, perhaps, the fact that it was an act of pure mourning, grief, and rage made it hard even for its participants to summarize afterward. Or maybe the riots felt so natural, so immediate, so appropriate, even those who would normally marvel at their scale fell quiet. Or maybe the state's massive project, begun immediately upon his death, of recapturing the image and meaning of King, played an active part in enforcing this silence, this forgetting, and so the riots are seen more as a simple funerary reaction than an uprising so fierce the government feared the Capitol would fall. It is, no doubt, some combination of all these factors. In any case, the Holy Week uprising seemed at the time to be a turning point in American disorder, and even after the fires had smoldered, revolution seemed just one more, quote, long hot summer, end quote, away. King had been in Memphis that spring to assist in radical black labor organizing there. He had spoken to a crowd of 15,000 on March 18th, calling for a general strike. The march he led from that speech resulted in rioting and looting. Even his physical presence no longer guaranteed nonviolence. But in those last years, he had begun to speak about a socialist transformation of America, and though he wasn't calling for violent revolution, neither was he chastising or rejecting rioters anymore. Unlike the uprisings of the previous summers, the Holy Week riots had no local instigating incidents of police brutality. Instead, the importance of Martin Luther King and the decade and a half of black liberation struggle had pushed the black community to the point of proto-revolutionary agitation and organization. People poured out of their houses wherever they were and tore shit up, trying to dismantle the system that murdered King, the very face of the respectable, peaceful movement the white power structure claimed it wanted to do business with. And again, I want to point out that there's a documentary that's called The Assassination of King. It's on the History Channel. You can watch it on YouTube. And it does a very good job of just pointing out all the things that took place after Dr. King was murdered in Memphis and assassinated in Memphis. It did a very good job of pointing out the way that people took to the streets after Dr. King was killed. And again, I do think that, you know, and I think the next book I'm gonna read is probably gonna be the autobiography of Martin Luther King on these Rockford readings. But I do think that it is very important to point out that you know, as far as the prototypical way to struggle, or the way that America would tell you right now to struggle for your rights or struggle for freedoms or struggle for liberation would be the way in which Dr. King struggled. Now, that's not to say that they would agree with Dr. King struggling. If Martin Luther King Jr. was doing all the things he did in the 50s and the 60s right now, white people would hate Martin Luther King Jr. and some uppity black people would hate Martin Luther King Jr. too. If people heard all the speeches that Dr. King gave and understood all the things that his movement entailed, not his movement, but all the things that the movement entailed that he was involved in, they would disagree with those things. They would not be in agreements with those things. What they agree with is the whitewashed version of Dr. King, is the retold, the Americanized version of Dr. King, the same way they agree with the Americanized and retold version of Harriet Tubman and Rosa Parks and all of these things. And again, that's not something that is only for black people. White people get whitewashed too. It just looks different. Black people get whitewashed in American history to seem like they were less passionate, or they were less demonstrative about the issues that they were, or less revolutionary about the issues that they were facing. And white people get whitewashed to seem like they were more demonstrative about things, or they were more supportive about things. This country whitewashes Abraham Lincoln to seem as if he was anti-racist, or he wasn't a racist, or he was against slavery, and he helped to free black people, and all of these different things. All the things which were not true. No person could become elected as a president during the time in which slavery existed and be against slavery. No person could be elected as a president in a time in which racism was so high institutionally and individually, and be anti-racist or against racism. Same thing for Thomas Jefferson. And you can see it as recent as Bill Clinton. I grew up in a time in which people made it seem as if Bill Clinton, I've heard black people say Bill Clinton was the first black president before, when I was a kid and growing up. And black people talk about Bill Clinton playing the saxophone and all of these different things. And meanwhile, Bill Clinton Bill Clinton is the reason that the mass incarceration which exists in our nation now exists at the level in which it does. Bill Clinton gave a tremendous amount of extra resources and funding to police departments and into the prison industrial complex. But what history has done, what Americanized history has done, is to whitewash him to seem as if he was some type of liberal hero or some type of democratic hero. Bill Clinton, who as he was running for president, president, took time out of his campaign to go to Louisiana, where he was the governor at, to watch somebody be executed, so that way he could say after the execution that he wasn't soft on crime, that he was tough on crime. And so I think we have to make sure that we are doing the job of actually finding out for ourselves and informing ourselves about all of these different historical figures, with the understanding that that once somebody dies and is no longer alive, this country will propagandize them to try to use them to co-opt whatever it was that they were struggling for when it comes to black people. And then the opposite is done when it comes to white people. In about 30 years, 40 years, they'll have 10, 20 schools named after Donald Trump, and they'll be trying to make it seem like Donald Trump didn't say none of the things that he said or did none of the things that he did. Lyndon Johnson was the president when the civil rights, the three biggest civil rights documents that got signed into legislation. Lyndon Johnson was the president. Lyndon Johnson was a senator from Texas who was a segregationist and who commonly referred to Martin Luther King Jr. as that nigger preacher. But again, if history will tell you that he was a liberal hero. All right, let's continue reading. With Dr. King's death, as Stokely Carmichael put it, quote, "Nonviolence was dead," end quote. At that point, organizing for the revolution seemed to be the most realistic way forward. This sense was not purely an American one, though. The feeling was global. The Cultural Revolution in China was at its height, and around the world, radicals were taking inspiration from the apparent deepening of the Chinese Revolution. Although Che Guevara had been killed the previous summer in a disastrous guerrilla campaign in Bolivia, where he and his comrades were executed by CIA-backed forces, he had become a global martyr and symbol of the era. The Cuban Revolution he helped win was going strong, forming a new pole of the radical leadership distinct from China and the USSR, the latter of which most revolutionaries in the 60s recognized as a reactionary capitalist state. And while many of the revolutionary Pan-African and socialist movements were on the back foot in Africa, particularly devastating was the ousting of Ghanaian President Nwamwe Nkrumah in 1966 and the collapse of the revolution in the Congo. Others, such as the struggle of the PAIGC and the Amélière Cabral and Guinea-Bissau, the increasingly successful war for independence in Angola, and the ongoing socialist collectivization of, quote, Ujamaa, end quote, practiced by Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere, seemed to point to an African continent in the midst of revolution. The riots of April 1968 in the United States were followed closely in May by massive riots and a general strike in Paris that almost toppled the government. Salvador Allende would be elected in Chile in 1970 on a wave of socialist agitation already making itself felt. Meanwhile, the Tet Offensive, launched in January 1968, saw the peasants of North Vietnam winning a war against the world's greatest imperial power. And so in the wake of the April uprisings, and in light of all these facts, explicitly revolutionary movements across the country exploded onto the scene. Following the black, quote, screaming queens, end quote, of the Compton's Cafeteria Rebellion in 1966, black trans women again pushed forward the revolution, leading the Stonewall Uprising in New York City in 1969 that gave birth to the queer movement. Within a few years, hundreds of queer advocacy organizations have sprung up across the country. The American Indian movement, formed in the summer of 1968, occupied Alcatraz Island in San Francisco in 1969, centering national attention on their militant demands and the continued colonial genocide of indigenous people. The Alcatraz occupation would only be forcibly evicted by federal troops 19 months later, and the movement built strength and power, climaxing in the occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973. The Black Panther Party achieved its meteoric moment of national prominence from 1968 to 1971. As the state increasingly turned to repression to tackle these growing movements, the prisons, too, exploded into organization and action, most famously with the riotous takeover and police massacre at Attica in 1971. That was only one of dozens of prison uprisings in the period. And again, I think one of the things that we have to point out is that historically, and that's been one of the things that has been at the forefront of in defense of looting, is that historically movements in this country have followed the Black Liberation Movement. The labor movement followed the Black Liberation Movement. When they bring here speaking about the queer movement being given birth to, and Black trans women's rights being struggled for, or trans women's rights being struggled for, they speak about Black trans women being at the forefront of it. When women's rights and the liberation the liberating of women is spoken of, it is Black women who are at the head of those things. And then even again, when other people's struggles and movements have arisen and have risen, it has been at the heels of the Black struggle. It's a reason that after Black Lives Matter became a common saying in America and in the country and in the world, it's a reason that other colors were then put there. The same thing for when Black Power became something that was said. You can constantly see here that besides just culturally, society wise, when Black people begin to struggle for something or begin to voice certain things, you see other groups who feel the same oppression or who feel similar oppressions find their voice in that as well. And I believe that that is what it will take for everyone to no group of people in this country will ever be liberated fully before Black people are liberated fully. It won't happen. This country will never have equal rights for women while Black people still don't have equal rights. Or there'll never be an equal pay grade or equal pay scale for women while it's not one for Black people or for any other group. It will be at the moment in which Black people find equity in this society, and Black women find equity in this society in which all women can find it. When Black people of color, or people of color that are Black, find equity in this society, that all people of color will be able to find equity in this society. Same thing for the LGBTQ plus community. When the Black members of the LGBTQ plus community find equity in this society, then you'll see it that the equity in this society will begin to trickle down to other people. But it's not until that point that we will ever get there. I don't speak of slavery as the original sin of this country, because the original sin of this country, the people of this country, was the stealing of the land that they engaged in. But simultaneously, as they were stealing that land, they began the slavery, the chattel slavery of Black people. And those things became completely intertwined with each other. And so until there is consolidation and reconciliation for the things that have happened to the descendants of the slaves, the African slaves in this country, you will never see any type of reconciliation for any other community that exists here. And I think that it should also be pointed out that Black people won't even let that happen. One of the reasons that people of Mexican descent or people that may come over from other countries and come here, the reason that their issues that they face are never being highlighted in the way that they should be highlighted is because this country continues to kill. Police keep killing Black people. You're never going to be able to fix the problem at the border or fix the problems that Mexicans deal with in this community or in this society, or Puerto Ricans or Cubans deal with in this society, as long as the problems that Black people and the descendants of slaves deal with continue to be at the forefront of this society and continue to not truthfully be remedied. As long as they continue to perpetuate the ghettos that they created and continue to perpetuate the violence in these communities that they created, you'll never see any of the other ills of this country adequately addressed. And I think that it would be a mistake on the part of Black people to allow anything else to become at the forefront of this society, because that is the biggest evil and the biggest contradiction and the biggest hypocrisy about this country, is that as this country goes and proclaims democracy and uses and perpetuates imperialism in all of these other places, the two groups of people who have sacrificed the most for this country to exist, that being the descendants of the African slaves that are here and the indigenous people of this land, whether that be the indigenous people who are in the northern part of this country or in the southern southern part of this country, they continue to be exploited. They continue to deal with the hypocrisies of democracy. They continue to deal with all of the evils of this country. So I again, it's just sort of repeating some of these things multiple times. But I think we have to, and it's been pointed out in here, we have to understand that a struggle for a more equitable working place will never be won until the struggle for Black lives has been won. The struggle for a more humane way of dealing with refugees and immigrants in this country will never be won until the struggle for Black lives has been won. And the struggle to end the imperialism that this country commits in other countries will never be won until the struggle for Black lives has been won. So we got to keep that at the forefront of what we're struggling here for. The anti-war movement also radicalized. Students, sometimes armed, occupied and took over university campuses across the country. This reached its apotheosis with the National Guard massacre of 4 protesting students at Kent State on May 4th, 1970. The Chicanx wing of the anti-war movement organized a march under the banner of the Chicano Moratorium and rioted in East LA in August. Police killed 4 of their number. Although popular history sometimes points to the Weathermen, a group of white anti-war radicals who favor pursuing riots, bombing, and guerrilla attacks on the state, they were more exemplary of a trend than the crazy radicals at the fringes they are usually described as. It is little remembered now, but the period was one of the most massive left-wing terrorism. Between January 1969 and the spring of 1970, there were 4,330 bombings in the United States. Massive movements emerged from within Chicanx, Asian American, and Puerto Rican communities, most famous among them the Young Lords, Asian Americans for Action, and the Brown Berets. Workers organized an awesome wildcat strike wave from 1967 to 1974. Feminism was transforming awareness across the country as consciousness-raising groups, books, and demonstrations proliferated. People with disabilities were organizing and fighting for accessibility and freedom, and a militant movement of poor mothers was fighting a winning fight for welfare. American soldiers in Vietnam were refusing their orders and killing their officers at record rates. Quote, fragging, end quote, was such a problem that the Army seemed on the verge of total collapse. Everywhere you looked, America seemed ready to explode. And again, this was some of the things that I was sort of trying to speak on just a moment ago before I went through and read this. But you see how all of these movements that different groups of people who are marginalized in America, all of these movements were coming at the heels of the Black Liberation Movement. All of these things were happening with the Black Liberation Movement being a catalyst in this society. And so we have to keep that at the forefront. Black people have never followed when it comes to movements in this country. Black people have always led, and it has been other groups that have followed. And if we're going to ever get to a place where we are successfully waging this struggle, it will come with Black people being at the forefront. It will come with the liberation for Black people being at the forefront. And so we have to take on that onus as vanguards of this movement, as leaders of the struggle, as with the understanding that there are so many other groups that are invested in us continuing this struggle and waging this struggle for them to continue and to wage their struggle. A wide range of movements were thus radicalized and activated by the National Black Insurrection and International Third World Revolution. As Keeanga Yamada Taylor writes, quote, when the Black movement goes into motion, it destabilizes all political life in the United States, end quote. I'm going to read that one more time. When the Black movement goes into motion, it destabilizes all political life in the United States. Black struggle had opened the door for revolutionary movements to blossom across the country, and it was the riots of 1964 through 1968 that seemed to indicate that the end of American empire was imminent and that the revolution only needed to be organized. But the riots didn't come back. There were no more long, hot summers. Without the mass energy and intense threat to the state the riots posed, white retrenchment and reaction slowly retook control. The COINTELPRO program, run by the FBI and police across the country, would kill more than 20 Black Panthers and imprison more than 1,000. Think about that. The COINTELPRO program, run by the FBI, that's where Collar Red was training at. The COINTELPRO program, run by the FBI and police across the country, would kill more than 20 Black Panthers and imprison more than 1,000. Would murder dozens of American Indian movement militants, would attack, disrupt, and infiltrate the Puerto Rican independence movement and the radical anti-war groups. Rather than social reform, the United States built its massive prison system, which grew partially as a way of guaranteeing the revolutionary movements of the 1960s and 1970s would not be repeated. Though America lost the Vietnam War, the main lesson the military learned was that a mass drafted army in a long, drawn-out war was too dangerous for morale. So the United States abolished the draft and developed a volunteer army made up of only the poor and the patriotic, and it increasingly privatized its military, pointing future U.S. strategy toward global police action, assassination, and special forces intervention, rather than massive ground war. And so one of the other things that, as we get into the end of this chapter, we got about a page left. You see that one paragraph tells you everything that you need to know about how this movement was. It's a big ass bug. Damn, big ass bug. Make sure to walk around this chair. No, leave him alone. He cool. We outside. This is the man. He cool. He don't gotta die. He don't gotta die. He cool. He good. Nah, he good. We outside. We in his shit. He good. He don't gotta die as long as he don't crawl on me. Nah, yeah. He ain't. We outside. I'm trying to be. As long as he don't crawl on me, I'm finna flick him. All right, man. He good. We got like a page left. We got a page left. He good. As long as he don't crawl in this chair. I'm watching. All right. But again, this paragraph tells you how instead of trying to put more money into programs to fight poverty, they built prisons. Instead of listening to what it was that the Black Panthers were speaking about, they killed more than 20 of the Black Panthers and imprisoned more than 1,000. Think about that. More than 1,000. And we just spoke here how Black Panther Party achieved this moment of national preeminence from 1968 to 1971. The Black Panthers we spoke about in this chapter, they spoke about them being founded and being mobilized in 66. And they that means that for some of these years, hundreds of Black Panthers were being thrown into jail, thrown into prison. And again, they got rid of the draft during this time. That was one of the things, too, that when you think back that it was a time where people were being drafted. People were refusing to go into the army. They would rather go to prison than go and serve in the army. And we live in a time now where you don't got to do the best commercials I ever seen growing up. They was always army commercials. They was always the Navy commercials, the military commercials. They seemed like they was some type of trailer for a blockbuster movie that was about to come out. And so I remember even being the first time I got arrested and went to jail and had lost my job when I was like 18 years old. I remember thinking, well, I guess I got to go join the army so I can make money or have a way to get money. And that's again, that's not something that I ended up doing. And this is not to denigrate people who are in the army or who choose to serve overseas, but it's just to say that that's how that's the type of institution and the type of country we are dealing with, where if the struggle is not waged to the fullest extent, if the revolution is not waged to the fullest extent, this country will figure out the things that they are doing wrong and will reform those things to make their system stronger. And so we have to make sure that we are not dropping the baton anymore. We can't afford for that to happen. Okay. Without increasing street action, the movements of the late 60s and 70s fell to repression, fizzled out, or devoured themselves through splits and infighting. And again, I want to continue to point out, without increasing street action. Everybody does not have to be in the streets, but we must understand that there is a power with being in the streets. Everybody does not have to march, or everybody does not have to participate in demonstrations, but we have to make sure that we are all doing the work of recognizing that it is power in those things, and that is the type of power that we will have to galvanize to combat these institutions, because that is the type of power that historically has been used to combat these institutions. Most of the political gains of the 60s have since been taken away by generations of, quote, tough on crime, end quote, politicians, Republican and Democrat alike, and the successive crises of the global capitalist economy, expressing themselves in more and more dramatic debt bubbles since 1973, have wiped out much of the social progress. Another revolutionary period ended in defeat. Although many of the victories have been wiped away, we can resist the suppression and deformation of its history. The centrality of rioting and looting to the period was intimately understood by its activists, rebels, and revolutionaries. But their voices have all too often been silenced or co-opted by liberal historians and conservative politicians. The question of nonviolence and the efficacy of rioting has once again been put on the table in Ferguson, Baltimore, Milwaukee, and Baton Rouge, in Charlotte, Chicago, Oakland, and Minneapolis, and Charlottesville, Berkeley, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. We can no longer afford to misunderstand the 60s, to excise the riots, and refuse to recognize the vital role they played in the upheavals that shook America to its core. We must do away once and for all with the myth of nonviolence and with the false moral divisions between uprising and social transformation, between insurrection and movement, between looting and boycotting, between rioting and community organizations. As Shakur Asada reminds us, it is our duty to win. All right, and that closes out Chapter 8, Civil Riots. Civil riots. That brings us to Chapter 9, The Inhumanity of Looters, which I believe will keep fast forwarding us to present day. And then the last chapter that is written in here is entitled Conclusion, and that is entitled, or the last chapter in here is Conclusion, and that's entitled Out of the Flames of Ferguson. So within that, that will get us closer to where we are presently in 2021. This brings us to, I think we're going to basically be picking up in 70. Yeah, it looks like this picks us up in about 73. And so one of the things I want to point out in review of this chapter is, again, that we can't separate the rocks being thrown outside of District 1 from speeches being given at outside of District 1. We cannot separate the looting that took place at Levels, or looting that took place at jewelry stores or whatever. That cannot be separated from the die-ins that took place later on. Or the boycotting of City Market, or the demonstrations of City Market, cannot be separated from the destroying of the police District 1 sign. And that, again, that's something that this book has been good in teaching me and reinforcing in me. This has been something that I have, and again, we have to learn to articulate these things. I think that is one of the main importances that I get from reading, is that with each book that I read, with each chapter that I read, I become more versed in being able to articulate not only the issue, but able to articulate all the different ideologies that will be needed for us to combat this issue properly. And so I would encourage people to please go purchase this book, In Defense of Looting by Vicky Osterweil. Whether you purchase it in person, I got this one from Barnes and Nobles. We got this one from Barnes and Nobles, or whether you purchase it with a book online, an ebook or audio book, or whether you go back and listen to all the different readings or watch all the different readings that we have done of this book. Please do the work of getting this information digested, and don't just digest it without comprehending it. Please do the work of reading and comprehending it, even if that means taking breaks in between reading it. So we'll end this one how we end the lives. Say justice for Demetrius Bennett, justice for Kerry Blake, justice for Logan Bell, justice for Mark Barmore, justice for Geno Washington, Justice for Jovan Fresco. Justice for Philip Johnson. Justice for Faustin Guaitigo. Justice for Suzette Babler. Justice for Jasper Banks. Justice for Mikey Guzman. Justice for Shannon Graves. Justice for Lil Mike Sago. Justice for Eddie Patterson. Justice for Joseph McCormick. We outside.